Genre is a French word for sameness in kind, type, or form, and it is used to refer to a distinct group, type, class, or category of artifacts that differentiate it from other groups. So, if you all have heard the word genre, you probably have heard it in either literature or film. And rhetorical criticism is something that borrows from film and literary criticism in many ways. And genre criticism, making it to rhetoric, really is a derivative of media criticism. So it probably is most intuitive for you all to think of genre in terms of films or TV, like horror movies or rom-coms or dramedies or dramas or comedies. So those are all examples of genres um, of film. And but you could take genre as a concept and apply it to any overarching type of rhetoric. So what puts them into groups and makes them distinct from other genres, like what makes horror distinct from rom-com? It's because there's specific patterns of rhetorical form and content that tend, like patterns within the horror genre, for example, are different than patterns within the romantic comedy genre. So those patterns or similarities are what distinguish the genres from each other. So examples of genre within rhetoric can definitely include media, but always just keep in mind that because we're doing rhetorical criticism, that your artifacts, your communicative artifacts that you're studying, there should be an argument that that could be considered rhetoric. So some examples of genre included, and some of these are listed in the book, and some of these I came up with on my own. And this can give you all an idea for what genre do you want to cover for your journal article. So feel free to take one of these examples or an example that's, that you think of related to one of these, or you could choose a genre that's not on this list. The weather forecast, the instruction manual, the closing argument at a criminal trial, or the grant proposal, those are all examples that were given in the text. So if you think of the weather forecast, for example, a weather forecast is going to have each weather forecast. When you tune in, you can expect a set of common practices in the way that the weather forecast is stylized, the way it's presented, the way that the forecaster speaks, the way that they stand, the way that they present the weather, and the way that they present themselves. So something as mundane as, a weather forecast is a type of rhetoric. Now moving into more media, which I'm totally fine with you all doing media for your genre criticism and analyzing a genre of media. We have, like, for example, the romance novel or the Stephen King novel, or like the Star Wars movie. When the first Star Wars movie came out, it wasn't its own genre, but now that it's a whole enterprise and a whole, galaxy with the series of episodes and stuff, you could say a Star Wars movie is the Star Wars movies are a genre. The Netflix documentary, that could be like a subgenre of the documentary, as the documentary film as a genre, or the documentary TV show. Netflix documentary is somewhere in between film and TV, so that's why I put it as its own. And that might be something that you all are interested in, like Netflix, when they do your algorithmic calculation of what you want to see, genre is a huge consideration for them. Like if you typically watch this type of show or this type of movie, then they're going to tell you you should watch other shows and movies that fall within under that type. Another genre could be a type of advertisement. Since advertising is so big, it's kind of hard to group all advertisements into one genre, but you could say like TV advertisements are one genre. But then you could narrow it down and say, for example, a laundry detergent TV advertisement, if that's something you were interested in criticizing, or the anti-smoking ad, or even like if we're thinking about rhetoric as being more expansive and not just being words, if rhetoric can also be visual and can include performances, for example, you could say like the TikTok dance video that is taking off or has taken off in our culture could be an example of a genre, or the gender reveal Instagram post. That's an example of a genre that's taking off in our, in our culture. And these things are short, like the TikTok dance video, the gender reveal IG video post. Those are short pieces of rhetoric, but that's part of what defines them as a genre, is that it's shorter than what the whole thing would be. Like, for example, when I was younger, we watched TRL music videos, not TikTok dance videos, but that's a different type of rhetoric. So it goes into a different genre. And then, for example, the Me Too post, so like a specific type of tweet, the sponsored or endorsement tweet. So like the tweets that say hashtag ad and then they endorse a particular product. You could look at that as a type of rhetoric. The ESPN news segment, or for example, the Fox News segment. So there are people who look at how does what are the similarities between each Fox News segment? Like what unites them? So they both have different form and different content in what they're talking about. Like ESPN news segment, it's going to be about sports. Fox News, it's going to be about politics, right? So that's already one thing that defines one genre from the other. And also back to visual rhetoric, you could think of even something like public art or graffiti as being a genre. All right. So a couple memes to sort of get you all to think more about what genre means at a philosophical level before we go on to talking about genre criticism. So you all might have heard, like, obviously you've heard, but you might not have thought about what the meaning of generic is before, like, but we commonly say like, oh, that's so generic. Like for example, his face is so generic it matches other every other face in our database, meaning this is just an average face, there's nothing to distinguish it from other faces like it. It is, as the text calls it, a generic prototype. Like it conforms to the genre. So this other one, like pictures on Shutterstock, are just so generic. Well, that's kind of the point of them, is that a picture on Shutterstock is generic enough that it could be taken and applied to a lot of different situations. So the more that you deviate from a generic form, the more specialized that your picture becomes, for example. So if something is so generic, that means that it's typical. It doesn't deviate from what you would expect from the genre. So when people talk about like horror movies and they say, "Oh, that was so predictable," the horror genre like has evolved to redefine itself because like the element of suspense and surprise is part of the horror genre. But if you don't evolve the genre in terms of how you produce that element of surprise, for example, then the horror film becomes so predictable that it's no longer, surprising or suspenseful. So the genre or people operating within that genre have to be careful to make it like not so generic that you just want to turn away and say, I've already seen this movie 100 times. And I'm sure you all can think of an example of a Netflix thing where you've watched it and it's imitating it's just a Netflix production that imitates, you know, what's popular in that genre. so much so that you tune out because you're like, I've already, even though you haven't literally already seen it, you're like, I've already seen this. That's because it's so generic. It conforms to the generic form so much. So, um, like this tweet, you posted a generic inspirational quote on Facebook. You must be so deep. This sort of sarcasm of, if you're generic, you're sort of you're predictable, and that when you use rhetoric in a certain genre and don't deviate from that genre, you're sort of using the template that the genre provides for you and then not contributing anything original. So, um, these are some of the negative connotations of genre in terms of doing genre criticism or learning about a genre. It doesn't mean that like being inside of a genre is always negative. That's not the implication. It's just I'm trying to get you to understand what the implication of the sort of word that we use all the time, just that's generic, what it means, which is it adheres to a form and in a predictable way. So for the meme font, why does everyone use this font? It's starting to get at memes have common characteristics that are easy to recognize and easy to like predict. So if you were going to use a meme, you would probably use like an automatic meme generator. But if you want your meme to look recognizable as a meme, you're not gonna change your meme font and be have like the curls MT meme or something. Like if you want your meme to be widely perceived, you're going to use this font. We as speakers within the genre influence the genre and the genre influences us. So even the example I just gave of memes, like why do all memes use this font? They don't necessarily have to, but they do. But at one point, someone or a group of people decided to start writing the memes that was like the picture on the bottom with the text on the top with, the black text on the top rather than the white bubble text on the picture. So when speakers within that genre changed the meme, it changed the genre. So now we have the meme genre and the two, there's two, basically two prototypical font options for the meme. So that genre influences the way that people write memes. Like I have a meme generator and it gives you two options. Like if I wanted to create my own meme, I would have to like do extra work because the genre basically provides the template for me to do two of those options. So that affects the way that I create memes. The genre affects the way that I create memes. But then also the way that people have created memes have also affected the genre so that memes aren't exactly the same as they were 5 years ago. And genres are contextualized to space and time. They aren't like a universal category that preceded human language. Like they're a construct of rhetoric, they're a construct of space humans in different spaces and times who are communicating. So another way of thinking of this is not only just that speakers within a genre influence the genre and then the genre influences the speakers, but also, and this is covered at multiple points in the text where they talk about both situational requirements and the rhetorical situation. The situation affects the genre, and the genre also affects the situation. You have like the Facebook profile that could be considered its own genre. But when looking, if you were to try to do a genre analysis and break down its defining characteristics, you might find that it's a really big project to try to take all Facebook profiles as a genre and define their characteristics. So you could say just the Facebook profile page was a genre of rhetoric, and that would not be inaccurate. But you could also break Facebook profiles down into subgenres of, for example, there's the business Facebook profile and there's the personal Facebook profile page. So those you could say are two different types of genre. So if you want to do a genre criticism on the personal Facebook profile, then you could get rid of all the business Facebook profiles and say, I'm just looking at this genre, this subgenre of rhetoric. So even though it falls under Facebook profile, it also takes on its own characteristics and can be described as its own genre. And you could break that down even further, right? So that leads to genre criticism as sort of this organizational tool that allows us to categorize, sort rhetoric into and classify rhetoric into categories. So genres are basically categories of rhetoric. And this like scholastically has roots in particularly Aristotle's assumption that situations can be categorized and fall into general types. So even though you all might have never thought I've done genre, criticism before, you all have taken public speaking. So chances are using the Aristotelian categories that you've already considered differences in genre and rhetorical genre before. For example, deliberative forensics and epideictic were Aristotle's realms of rhetoric. Like the deliberative would be for the Congress, forensics for the courts, and epideictic was the rhetoric of praise and blame. So, for example, a funeral oration or the wedding speech. You know, those are different classes or types of rhetoric that call for particular rhetorical responses. And so the public speaking class across the communication discipline in America mimics Aristotle's three realms of rhetoric, but has sort of updated those genres to include informative, persuasive, and celebrational. So most of you did 3 speeches, one in each genre. And as you went through the class, you learned that there's a specific, there's specific expectations that are required for a rhetor if you're in the informative versus if you're in the persuasive. You have a different purpose, but you also have different stylistic ways of addressing your audience. It's something that allows us to say the rhetoric of, like the rhetoric of the instruction manual, the rhetoric of the weather forecast. That usually indicates that a genre criticism is going on here, because if you're trying to define the rhetoric of a particular type of thing, then and draw a general conclusion about it, that's doing genre criticism. You're defining a genre and saying the rhetoric of this particular type of thing has particular characteristics that are worth considering and sorting out and distinguishing from rhetorics of another type. So like the rhetoric of the weather forecast is different than the rhetoric of the international news forecast. There's a reason for that. So it's worth exploring. So there's 3 main reasons to look into genre criticism. First is the utilitarian or artistic reasons, and I sort of touched on this with Aristotle, but defining the normative characteristics of a genre can help us become better producers of rhetoric within that genre. That's why, your teachers teach you about this is what a good informative speech is, so that you can apply that for, I say utilitarian or artistic reasons, because artistic reasons meaning like you want to be the best artist that you can be, and you want to give the best performance that you can be, but it could also be utilitarian in that like that performance is getting you something. Like in the case of your public speaking, it's usually just like a grade, but it's supposed to mimic, when if you were in an interview, for example, when you're using the rhetoric of an interview, or when you write um, your one-page personal statement to your schools that you're applying to, you want to nail that form and to not deviate too much from the expectations of that genre, or else you might not get the job, or your application might get passed over. So you have to have a balancing act where you're not like so generic that you're just prototypical of the form, but you don't deviate so far from the form that you are off-putting, or you come off as being unprepared, or that you don't understand what the norms of your field are, for example. And then for us academics, the philosophical or scholarly reason to study genre criticism is to help us understand how genre shapes, generates, changes, and influences rhetoric more broadly. And this is related to the philosophical or scholarly reasons. That also influences, just because, because rhetoric shapes reality, that can influence the speakers or the audience members in terms of um, it, that genre criticism can probe and reveal how systems of belief, ideologies, and values are both captured within a genre, but also how they're disseminated within a genre in a way that influences their audiences. So, like, for example, the country western film genre had this like heroic, rugged, individualistic, male, white hero who went off and mastered his surroundings, his environment, and defended himself against all other, you know, cowboys and Indians out there. So that it wasn't just entertainment. Like, that's why I like to think of media as rhetoric too, because it's like to argue that a country western was only fulfilling an entertainment purpose when there were clearly American beliefs and ideologies and values that were latent within that, but that genre also glorified and encouraged audiences to identify with, that there are potentially dangerous elements of genres that are worth it to, um, like, for example, glorifying violence or glorifying oppression against particular categories of people. It's worth it to understand how a genre can facilitate those valuings, like hierarchies of certain types of people, for example, and how that rhetoric can influence audience members. What are their beliefs? How does that influence their actions and how they view themselves interacting in the world? So for breaking down a genre, and this is important for completing your task for this last journal article. Any rhetorical genre has three elements. And these elements are basically, when you choose your genre, what you're trying to figure out are the like the core common characteristics that define your genre. So there's the situational requirements, which basically is what is the common situational elements that unite these types of rhetoric. So, like the meme, for example. The situation obviously has to do with the internet. Um, and so the production of the meme on the internet is one of the base situational requirements. Consider things to consider would be the place and our medium of the rhetoric. So, the internet being, and particularly social media being the place and our medium of the meme, or the purpose for the rhetorical situation could be something that you would take in consideration. Like, is the purpose, like the instruction manual, for example, that's a clear case where the purpose is really what defines the situational commonality. And then for the characteristics, this is what you're really going to be you're doing your analysis looking for. Based on your observations of horror films, what are the common characteristics that unite horror films? And that's doing the analysis of trying to come up with what are the substantive and stylistic characteristics or patterns or commonalities that span across all the different artifacts in this genre. And then the organizing principle is sort of a catchphrase that you come up with after doing your characteristic analysis that captures the essence of a genre. So in the text, they talk about in the method section, they talk about three types of genre criticism. They talk about generic description, generic participation, and generic application. Um, we're only doing the generic description part. So we're describing, like you all are picking a genre and you're going to define or just describe that genre based on its characteristics. Like go with something that you have experience or familiarity with to make your research easier or more organic on this. So to make it easier for yourself, give yourself a genre that you have some familiarity with. It doesn't have to be like the genre that Netflix chooses for you and says this is the one you watch the most, or the genre that you are sick and tired of. You know, it doesn't have to be the genre that you use the most. It's just a genre. Choose a genre that you're familiar with so that this assignment isn't daunting and it comes off more easier or organically for you. And then you'll want to select artifacts that represent the genre. So again, based on um, our work in Unit 1, selecting your artifacts involves collecting artifacts that are representative of that sample, of that rhetoric. So if you chose horror movies, you shouldn't look at a rom-com. You know, it's a filter. So if you choose a genre, you're going to be looking at artifacts that fall in that genre. And if it's something like this, like movie is confusing because it seems like it's a horror movie, but it's also like a comedy. Well, then it's an outlier. Just push it out. Like if it doesn't meet the genre, it's gonna complicate your analysis. And there's enough things that meet your genre. So like um a mockumentary, for example. Don't put that in with a documentary. It's not the same thing as a documentary. It just clouds up your analysis. If you're trying to say what are the common characteristics of documentaries and you threw a mockumentary in there, that would throw your whole study off. So you don't have to be, you want to be generic in your generic selection of artifacts. Like you want to pick things that are so generic and prototypical. And for the third step, this is, you know, and this is, I'm not making you do the full 4 step uh, with the full rhetorical criticism essay for this last journal. It's more an abbreviated analyze your artifacts and write up, like give us a write up of your analysis is essentially what this assignment is. But analyzing your artifacts is a big part of rhetorical criticism before you go to write your paper. So make sure that you save time to actually do this step, to code, to take, like go through your artifacts, take notes on them, whether that be watching or reading, you know, and picking out what are the situational, what are the substantive, what are the stylistic elements of these artifacts, and then what are the commonalities after I look at those. So you want to define the genre and formulate your construct, like formulate your theories about what are its characteristics. And so in this process, you are looking for shared characteristics of the rhetoric. And um, one of the tips that I thought was helpful from page 185 is just like, don't stress too much about is this form, is this content, because it might be a characteristic that's sort of both form and content. And so rather than like just focus on the elements that stand out to you. Do this like organically where if you had horror movies and you watched 3 horror movies and you sort of took notes on the characteristics, like what I just came up with, they use music suspensefully to build up suspense. okay, is that's kind of a question of form and content because like form is that they're using music. The purpose, like the content purpose is like it's building up suspense. So if I just said that element stood out to me that they use music to like build up suspense, then that could be one of cha- my elements, my core characteristics of that genre without stressing too much about delineating that as a form or content. And then after you've done all of that analysis and come up with your list of characteristics, you'll want to formulate your organizing principle and you'll see page 187 to for advice on how to formulate the organizing principle that captures the essence of the strategies common to your artifact. Page 185 to 186, over here I put a note. There's an example of one paragraph artifact analyses in the instance of narratives produced by survivors of breast cancer as one of them. The second one is the email ballot. And the third is corporate history. So if you want to see an example in of an author who's able to take a genre of rhetoric and neatly summarize its core characteristics in one paragraph, which is what you're going to have to do. See page 185 to 186 to see these examples of how they efficiently, or Foss efficiently took one genre of rhetoric and summarized its core situational and stylistic and substantive characteristics in order to define that genre. So the genre criticism that you all will do this week will not be the full length 4-step process, but it will involve you analyzing artifacts within a genre and then writing up a journal article about your analysis.